the Office of Budget Responsibility produces forecasts in the spring. Historically, they also assess the fiscal rules, and chancellors tend to turn that event into a fiscal event because they like announcing policies. This time, however, Rachel Reeves has said that the fiscal rules won't be assessed formally at the spring statement. She said many times too that she only wants one fiscal event. So the question I'm being asked all the time is, will the spring statement be used as a policy moment? What do you guys think? What are we going to expect? What are you guys expecting?
It seems like, the last budget we had, however long ago it was, feels like ages ago now, but it wasn't really, was it? There was like 74 measures or something. So it's not like we've been short of like policy reforms. In that sense, it doesn't seem like it should be necessary to come back 3 or 4 months later and have another bite of the cherry. On the other hand, the local elections will be coming up 2 months or something after the spring statement, and so maybe that's a natural time to announce something that might be popular.
I guess on a more micro level, this is a government that's doing lots of reviews and and lots of white papers and lots of other things that we've been talking about. A fiscal event is a natural time to try and actually put some money where your mouth is on some of those conclusions. So it's possible that there is going to be enough policy making pressure from things the government wants to do anyway.
I mean, for what it's worth, my guess is that we won't see a big fiscal event this spring. In normal times, because of the May elections, chancellors like to stand up and announce things. But given that Rachel Reeves has just said, I'm changing the sort of framework in order to not have the rules assessed, and I want one fiscal event, it would be kind of funny at the first opportunity to then say, well, actually, I'm going to have a fiscal event anyway. So we'll be ready for one in case one pops up, but I suspect we won't see that. There'll be an interesting question about what they do instead, whether they just stand up, whether Rachel Reeves just stands up and just announces the forecast, or whether she uses an opportunity to maybe look back at, almost like re-announce what's already happening and talk about what they're already doing, or maybe focus on a part of the forecast. My guess is that we won't see a big fiscal event in spring.
What do you think would be like a good use of the parliamentary time? If you have to stand up and say something, you can literally stand up and say the OBR now says X, Y, Z.
Good question. I think about this morning. I think it's different ways to think about it. One is also for the political moment in time, right? So ignore the kind of economic and policy making, just that it's a political moment where the chancellor gets the dispatch box. What could she do with it? And I think there is maybe a case to say, almost remind Parliament and people what has already been announced, what policy is doing, update them on things like the government announced lots of investment spending. How's that going? What are they doing? What have they got planned? What is being reviewed? When's it going to come up? It's almost not have it be about the forecasts per se, but more about what the government is doing to try to move the dial on those forecasts. If the forecast has moved against her and got worse, she could use it as a chance to say why she is or isn't worried, and say something about what might happen in the budget, or what she's going to prepare between now and the budget. So almost use it as a political moment. On the economics, in some sense, I'm not sure it is the right moment to be announcing things. Again, if it's a fiscal event, make it a fiscal event. But like you said, we've just had a fiscal event. In some sense, the timing we have of our fiscal events is kind of funny. It's a hangover from a past period where, previous chancellors had kind of like a pre-budget report in the autumn, then the budget in the spring, and that made sense for the timing. But now we have the budget in the autumn, and the spring statement comes very quickly afterwards. It's almost too quickly. So given it's that quick, I think you're right, Tom. We've had so many policies already, we don't need new announcements. And on the reviews, given some of them won't report until the autumn, I assume that actually the next budget is the time to be saying, we've done the reviews, we've worked the policies up, we've got the backbenchers on board with a plan, now we're going to put something forward rather than try and rush it through from spring. So in some sense, I think a good use of it is just to, debate the underlying issues. Let's have part of the conversation about SEND. Let's talk about policy options. Let's think about what government could do on some of these issues rather than rush to the policy. But actually, on the autumn budget, another question we keep getting asked is, will taxes rise again in autumn? Again, for what it's worth, never say never, right? Given that the Chancellor gave herself a bigger headroom against her fiscal rules, it's not impossible, but I think it's unlikely that the forecast will move in such a way that completely gets wiped out. So I don't think we'll be in a situation where something happens that means she has a big fiscal repair job on her hands kind of situation. That should be good news about what's going to happen. Last year was a year where there was tons of speculation. We talked a lot about this in a previous podcast, about how the uncertainty that creates is really damaging. Of course, you mentioned earlier the elections, Tom. There's clearly some political related uncertainty this year. The papers are full of speculation whether Starmer will make it, if we got a change of leader or a change. I'm sure that would open up lots of speculation about how that new leadership would change the budget. So we can't rule out that. I think the risks actually, though, the big risks are looking a bit further ahead, looking at things like when that 6 billion pressure of spend starts to become, in year. We get to the election, there are tight spending plans, there are all these reviews. Are we really thinking they're going to announce plans to all these reviews and not have any extra spending? So I suspect the big risk around tax rises is not really for this autumn, but for a few years hence. But we'll see, I guess. But on the forecasts, it's always important to remember that there's always a huge amount of uncertainty around them. We don't know what this year will look like. Nor does anybody else. But we said we'd indulge in some, at least, speculation about a couple of maybe the potential risks or sources of good news that might change things for the Chancellor and the kind of economics. So Tom, AI. Everyone wants to talk about AI. Speculate about AI for us.
Yeah, obviously there's lots of questions one could ask about AI. I mean, the truthful answer for all of them is we don't know. But I think, there's a lot of focus on what's going to happen to people's jobs for understandable reasons. But perhaps the first question is, what's it do to output? Like, how's it going to affect the amount of goods and services that we can produce each year? If it has a big positive effect on output, then it's a question about how that ends up getting distributed amongst the population. But to a first approximation, that seems like a pretty good thing. It gives the government a lot more opportunities. It would ease the government's constraints if there was this sudden, real increase in economic growth. Now, whether or not that will emerge, your guess is as good as mine. I think on the labour market side, there's sort of some hints that there's some effects on things like software developers. There was quite a prominent piece of research in the US suggesting that kind of entry-level jobs for software developers have started to go down in number. Whether or not that just turns out to be one isolated example or a much wider spread thing, that obviously is yet to be determined. I think what matters for individuals, for workers, is it something that's labour replacing? So it's sort of there, I can come in and just do your job, and there's nothing left for you to do, and that's going to, on an individual level at least, that's going to be bad for you. Or is it labour augmenting? It's something which can kind of take the certain parts of your job, allowing you to focus on the most high value stuff. Then that would be good for individuals. That would tend to result in an increase in wages. So who knows? But if there was something to kind of ride to the rescue for the government, maybe this could be one possibility.
I think that's that kind of who knows question is one reason why the government's put so much emphasis on skills policy lately. Because if you're going to do a who knows labour market, what you really need is a skills system that's going to let people work out a few years at a time. Actually, I need to retrain. Actually, this is now in demand. Actually, that coding course that the government encouraged me to take 3 years ago is no longer so relevant because no one's hiring entry-level coders. So that skills policy link becomes a lot more important as well.
One to review. Let's do one more. I know, Christine, you're keen on this one, so let's talk about GLP-1s.
Yeah, so GLP-1s, most people will know better as things like Ozempic or Wegovy or Mounjaro. So these are they're called weight loss drugs. There's probably a little bit of a question mark of why we're talking about this on a podcast largely around the labour market and economics. But if you think about what we've covered today, a lot of that is about health and how does health affect people's ability to participate in the labour market. So obesity is quite a big part of the health picture in the UK. Around a quarter of UK adults are, in the jargon, living with obesity. And there's been a lot of policy that tries to shift that. It's been pretty hard to shift. That's not a UK problem, that's a kind of developed world problem. That's pretty common.
We should just highlight, maybe you're about to do this, but we should highlight that living with obesity also doesn't just mean they might, want to look a different way. Actually, that comes with real health consequences.
Real health consequences. So that's, the second most common cause of cancer. Huge impacts on conditions like diabetes or other metabolic conditions. It also means that lots of other health problems that you might have worse outcomes. We saw that really poignantly during the COVID pandemic, where people who were living with obesity had much, much worse outcomes if they were getting the COVID-19 virus. And it means that things like surgeries often can't take place because you're over the limits for being able to be operated on. So there are real challenges here in terms of not just that specific health issue, but what that means for people's wider health as well. And so that means that actually we've had all of this policy very much focused on lifestyle, diet, and exercise. That's not going to go away. That's still going to be really important. What we do have now are some medications that do pretty conclusively seem to, at least in the short term, help people to reduce excess weight. And that could be really impactful on people's lives, but also on if it is helping to solve some of these knock-on health consequences on their wider health, and therefore on some of the benefits and the pressures that we've seen in the benefit system and other systems as well as people who are being kept out of the labor market for reasons of ill health. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch. Very in the UK context, that's going to be particularly tough for the NHS to thread that needle. So we know that around 5% of UK adults are already using these drugs. The vast majority of them are paying for them privately, and they're expensive. So you get really big health inequalities there, where richer people are able to go and afford these drugs, poorer people are not, and are stuck waiting for that to receive them on the NHS. The NHS estimates that millions of people would be eligible even under the criteria currently in place, but only hundreds of thousands are going to be able to access them in the foreseeable future because they're so expensive. So there's a real question here on the public services side, as well as the labor market side, of getting that balance right between the costs of providing these drugs versus the benefits that they might have for the health service in terms of bringing down some of that burden of disease that we've seen growing pretty inexorably over time, which has been a big contributor to rising NHS budgets.
I know there were reports over Christmas that I was seeing that looking like a postcode lottery and access some of these things where different NHS trusts are making different choices about how to give access to them, partly related to the cost. And it rates, like you said, the send earlier. Some of these things might have implications in the long run if you can get, people into better health. But there is often a price tag with this. And it looks like the evidence suggests that people also need to be on these drugs for quite a long. You take them for 2 years. You'll pay again and you stop taking them. Actually, there could be a long-term cost to some of these drugs.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work still to be done to work out what's the right treatment regime around these drugs. So there seems to be pretty good evidence that if you just kind of take the drug as a weight loss drug, come off of it 6 months later, many people regain a lot of the weight that they had lost. There's bigger question marks over if you're coupling that with, for example, coaching or lifestyle support or diet support or exercise support, all of these other interventions that the UK's made a lot of policy on recently. Is that going to help moderate that effect and give you a longer term benefit for the drugs? Or really are we looking at this as obesity is a chronic health condition and the medication that you're taking is therefore going to be a long-term medication as well?
And there's I've seen some suggestions as well, it might even help quit smoking and things like that, because it's just sort of, I don't really know the details of this, but it reduces the desire.
Yeah, there's lots of wider studies. I think it's quite an emerging area of literature. There's lots of wider studies that are looking at impacts on mental health, impacts on gambling, as you say, on smoking, on lots of addictive behaviors or sort of desire, pleasure-seeking behaviors. So if that's true, if that pans out, then potentially effects get kind of even bigger than the first order effects on excess weight. But even effects on excess weight, that's a big enough deal that we should be paying attention to.
Another link between both AI and these weight loss drugs is also that the government has some